We're going to continue with the end of the High Renaissance and then move into a period called Mannerism. So we are looking at a work of architecture by an artist named Bramante. Bramante is sort of the great, or one of the great architects of the end of the Renaissance period, the High Renaissance. You were looking at a building called the Tempietto, meaning little temple. This is what is known as a martyrarium. A martyrarium is a building built for a martyr. This is for St. Peter. This is what's considered traditionally to be his place of burial. Bramante was from Milan. He had just moved to Rome to study Roman architecture. Like a lot of architects, he came under the sort of influence of Pope Julius II. Like a lot of artists, he came under the influence of Pope Julius II, I should say. We all know about Pope Julius, and he's wanting to bring Rome back to its former glory. And this is a sort of, for me, a perfect example of high Renaissance architecture. It looks very different than early Renaissance architecture because remember, Alberti wanted things flat, he wanted things perfect, he wanted things this sort of flat, two-dimensional, geometric, perfect Platonic forms. Here we see an almost sculptural quality to the architecture. You can see, first of all, there's a lot of play with depth and shadow. By creating this circular building and including what is called a colonnade is a row of columns around this central rotunda. A rotunda is a round building, colonnade, rotunda. We can see there is a play with the overhanging porch with the shadows. It creates a very sculptural quality. If we look at the second story, you can see there's alternating sort of ovoid or circular and rectangular niches, alternating one after the other, set very deeply into the facade. So this whole thing creates this kind of dramatic shadow. This was originally supposed to be part of a plaza that was circular in form, so this circular form would have been repeated in and out. That never happened due to various reasons, and so we have it kind of shoved here in this little square court. So it doesn't quite have the same effect that it would, but we are looking at a shift in architecture from the sort of formal, very kind of dry, Platonic squares and circles and triangles to this more dramatic, shadowy, sculptural kind of architecture. And that kind of goes along with the High Renaissance in general. Everything is, artists are kind of pushing the boundaries more and more. And the art and architecture is getting more expressive and more dramatic. Bramante was also asked to design a new basilica for St. Peter's. St. Peter's is the main basilica of the Pope in Rome, and it had by this point it was over 1,000 years old. And initially the desire was to sort of remodel it, and then eventually that turned into, well, let's just tear it down and build something new. Bramante came up with a central plan construction that was very reminiscent of Roman buildings, used as sort of the main inspiration was a old Roman building called the Pantheon, which you see on the left, and that's Pantheon. This is an old Roman temple that was dedicated to all the gods, and it was, and still is, one of the most famous buildings ever built. At the time, it was the largest dome in the world. It was actually the largest dome until the Cathedral of Florence was constructed, and Bramante's dome was put on top. But this was going to rival that and rival the Pantheon's dome. It's a very segmented building of repeated forms, creating a very sort of dramatic space is what Bramante wanted. Alas, this was never constructed, but we do get an idea of what it would have looked like. We actually see a series of repeated domes. Just like in the Tempietto, we see sort of dramatic use of colonnade and colonnades around the rotundas underneath the domes. You can imagine the sort of dramatic effect this probably would have created with light and shadow, but this was never actually completed. Michelangelo then came in to kind of clean things up, and a lot of his basic designs have remained, although the building is no longer a central plan. The current St. Peter's has a long, what we call a nave area, so it's not a square like this, although much of Michelangelo's design ultimately survived. He opened things up from Bramante. It's not as confusing of a space as the previous one with all these sort of smaller segments. But both artists were very much trying to reference classical Roman architecture, Greek and Roman, because there are in both cultures traditions of these circular formed temples, and so they wanted to build these Christian churches based on this kind of circular Greek and Roman plan. A lot of early Christian architecture too is also based on this plan. I mean, Greek and Roman influence is everywhere, but so this is a very old form that these guys were bringing back. You can see, though, that what was kept, though, were these sort of dramatic, protruding, in this case, buttresses, creating a really dramatic sense of shadow. You can kind of see over here. So, and in fact, the entire building with these sort of scalloped areas, these little semicircular, what's known as an apse, A-P-S-E, alternating with these square forms, creates a really beautiful sense of rhythm and variety. And so gone is that kind of boring, flat Albertian facade. And here we have movement and shadow and drama. What we have next is a work by Antonio da Sangallo the Younger. This is the Palazzo Farnese. Farnese were a very powerful family. Farneses would be popes, they would be bishops, they would be cardinals. It is one of the great sort of Italian power families, much like the Medici. This is their home. This was completed by Michelangelo. You can see here once again, the key here is on variety. If you will look especially at the second story, we can see a sort of rejection of the early Renaissance Albertian principles with these little pediments above the windows. And notice how they alter between this more classical Greek triangular pediment and this semicircular pediment. Once again, there is a sense of drama created by these pilasters sort of jutting out, protruding from the surface, creating a sort of deep set frame around the window, creating a dramatic use of shadow. The same can be seen here in the inside courtyard. We see those repeated forms, although this time the triangular pediments get their own story and the semicircular pediments get the other. But I think it's really here in this courtyard, especially with this arcade. An arcade is a row of arches. Down here at the bottom, you can really see that play with shadow. But so there's the keys here are sort of variety, this protrusion of three-dimensional forms, this sort of rejection of flatness of the facade, are elements that Michelangelo is playing with here. So we're going to move now from Rome to Venice. Venice is a very wealthy city, or was a very wealthy city, especially at the time. It is a trading capital. Where Venice is located, it is sort of at the center of several different sea routes, several different land routes, and is kind of at this sort of nexus point between Asia, Europe, and Africa. And it was a very wealthy and powerful city because of its position as a trading capital. Very famously, 14th century merchant Marco Polo left from Venice to establish trading connections in the Far East. And it was sort of the end point of what was known as the Silk Road. Now, the Silk Road wasn't just one road. It was a series of roads or routes, however you want to say it, of routes heading all the way to the east. And there was a sort of a series of different ways that goods were transported, kind of depending on the area, from horseback to camel to, large caravans. So it's not just like a super highway connecting East Asia to Europe and the Middle East, but it was a series of routes. And they all kind of terminated into Venice. And so you can imagine the kinds of goods that would be being imported. Things, anywhere from salt and spices from India and the Middle East to fine rugs and tapestries and other kinds of textiles from the Middle East and all the way into Persia and China. Things like porcelain and silk from China. And then, of course, goods from northern Africa and even deeper. So things like ivory and stuff from Africa, iron from Europe, produce, things like that from various parts across Europe. And so Venice became a very wealthy and a very powerful city as a trading capital. It was also a very beautiful city. Venice is known for its sunlight and its warm weather and its canals. And it's very much a city of sort of luxury and beauty. And in many ways, it's very different from the cultures of Florence and Rome that we have been studying. There is a kind of elegance to Venetian art and architecture that sort of rejects some of the more sort of stiffness of a lot of Renaissance art. It rejects this sort of moral humanism. And there's more of an emphasis on luxury and beauty in Venetian art. This is a work by an architect named Palladio. It is called the Villa Rotunda. This was built for a retired priest, a guy named Almerico. But what's important is that this was meant to be a place where this old, retired, powerful priest could host parties and could have people come and visit and view the countryside of this beautiful Italian villa. It was modeled after our favorite building, the Pantheon, this ancient Roman temple with its dome. Although the Pantheon has sort of one porch area and the Villa Rotunda has four. It is aligned in a way that it's built at 45-degree angles to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. But it's designed in a way so every room gets sun. Also, every room has or every sort of angle of the house has a spectacular view. It is designed to create sort of an optimal experience for the people staying here to view the landscape and the sun. The entire building is built on a concept of sort of beauty and the enjoyment of beauty and having an aesthetic experience. It uses Roman and Greek elements all over the place. We have Ionic capitals, we have pediments, and we have this Roman-style dome. So it is a central planned building, and you can see that here. But the emphasis on this building is not so much perfection as we would see in a Florentine or a Roman style building, but instead the emphasis here is on beauty and sort of the experience one has by being in this building of beauty. So here is a view of Venice about a century or so later. But you can see that it's this city built on canals. It is a city that sort of prides itself on its beauty, on its architecture, and it's a very old city, so it prides itself on the sort of the beauty of its historical buildings. Venice was one of the first areas where the artist embraced oil painting, especially in Southern Europe. Oil painting was initially more associated with Northern European art. So Venice is known for its very rich colors. I like to think of sort of the silks and the textiles coming into Venice at this time with their beautiful dyed colors, being an inspiration for the kinds of colors that we will see. There is a sensuous, warm quality to a lot of Venetian art. So this is a painting. Actually, we're not going to look at this. So this is an altarpiece called the Zaccaria altarpiece by Venetian artist Giovanni Bellini. Venetian painters, as we said, were one of the earliest to use oil painting in Italy, and you get this rich color because of that. There is a term I want you guys to really know. It's called colorito, and colorito means literally color, but in many ways it's the opposite of that word we talked about last time called disegno. Disegno, remember, is not just design or drawing, but it's sort of like the moral and intellectual process behind that. It is meant, disegno is meant to sort of represent a kind of moral, perfect view of the world. So things are designed in a way and laid out in a way where you're making sure there's harmony and perfection. That is the emphasis over everything. Colorito sort of is embracing not just of color, but really of sort of sensuality in general. And I don't mean sensuality in a sexual way, although this could apply to that, but instead I mean sensuality in the experiences we have with our senses. Think of delicious food or good, smell of good cooking, or soft fabric, or beautiful color. This is kind of what colorito encompasses. And so it's not only about the way the artist paints. And Bellini used the quality of oil paints by applying these very, very thin glazes and sort of laying thin layer after thin layer on top of each other, creating these really deep, rich, sensual colors. But it's also about the entire sort of experience of everything that's going on in the painting. There's an emphasis here on details. There's an emphasis on the carvings and the pilasters on the wall. There's an emphasis on the painting of the mosaic in the apse above above Mary here. There's an emphasis on the instruments. So we can imagine this entire image here as kind of this central overload of sound, of music, of color, of texture and pattern. It's almost overwhelming. We see that here in another image of a guy named Saint Francis. Saint Francis of Assisi was a 13th century monk who began the Franciscan order. Saint Francis, very famously, he was the son of a wealthy family, and the story goes that he rejected his privilege, and he dedicated himself to a life of poverty, and dedicated himself to God, and he rejected the sort of fine clothes that he had grown up wearing, and the very famous story is that he's in this public market with his father, and he strips himself bare of his fine clothes and hands them to his dad, and then walks off and lives in the woods for a while, as you know, a way of being sort of closer to God, closer to nature. And so that's what we're seeing here, St. Francis living as a hermit in a cave. But if you look at the way Bellini has painted this very sensual, detailed landscape behind St. Francis, as he stands here in front of his home with his biblical studies next to him, we can see that Bellini has sort of layered, almost in segments, this background. We have the rocky area here, then we have sort of this mid-ground field with the animals, and then this further sort of segment, each layer getting sort of harder to see. This is something called atmospheric perspective, where the artist is trying to recreate the illusion of an atmosphere. And as things are further away, they tend to be hazier and less focused. But also notice how there is a richness in detail, even though we are looking at a scene that is meant to represent the austerity in which St. Francis lived and the way he sort of rejected material goods. It's a very pretty painting, isn't it? Every sort of rock, every sort of pebble on the ground, and then of course the various vegetation, even these bare trees have a very sensual quality to them. And everything is kind of bathed in this sunlight, this beautiful Venetian glow. Venice was known for its sun. And so everything there's this sort of warm sunlight quality on everything in this painting. If you want to see some warm sun, look no further, my friends. Colorito is in full effect here. Color is employed in a dominant manner for sensual expressive purposes. This is by an artist named Giorgione, who was a student of Bellini, and also possibly another student, a guy named Titian. This is known as Pastoral Symphony. This is, it has been interpreted as an allegory for creativity. We have these two musicians out in the field. These women are supposed to maybe represent Greek muses. Muses were goddesses of the arts. And we see even one woman over here on the left going towards a well, as this was meant to represent the well of inspiration, and she is drawing from it. And that may or may not be true. But really, the allegory here sort of takes second place to just the sheer beauty of what we're seeing here. These rich, expensive fabrics worn by the musicians, this sort of beautiful sensual bodies of these nude women here, the sort of quaint shepherd in the background with his sheep. The word is bucolic, right? This pretty sort of natural scene, creating this very bucolic, almost Garden of Eden sort of feel. There's another term called Arcadian, Arcadian. Arcadia is sort of the Greek Eden. It's this sort of time before time. It's this place before the sort of man arrived, and it's this kind of perfect, pristine world. And that is kind of what he's depicting here. This is really not set in any sort of given time period or about any sort of specific moment. But this is kind of this utopian, perfect, beautiful moment that doesn't really exist anywhere. The emphasis here is more on just creating something really, really pretty to look at. And so we have these rich, warm Venetian sun tones. We have the sunlight playing on the bottom of the clouds. And we have no real interest in sort of creating these muscular, strong bodies that we are used to seeing in Florentine and Roman art. But instead, everything has a soft, gentle, sensual quality to it. And sort of the roundness of the forms of the bodies is what is emphasized. So gone are sort of those tough, Michelangelo women with their huge muscles that we have seen in the Sibyls of the Sistine Chapel. And here we have these sort of soft, fleshy bodies, which is something that reoccurs over and over in Venetian art. Here's another Giorgione. This is called The Tempest. This is a painting that confuses the living out of art historians because we're not exactly sure what it's about. We have this soldier here separated from this woman who is nursing. We don't know if this is a biblical scene. We know that he moved this figure from closer to the woman to over here. We're not exactly sure what's going on. If this is an allegory, this is a Greek and Roman mythological scene, this is a biblical scene. What is this oncoming storm? What is this tempest in the background? We don't know. And ultimately it doesn't matter. There's lots of interpretations of this painting. But once again, the emphasis is on beauty above everything else. This is the Venetian way. This beautiful, dramatic storm, this tempest in the background, this quaint little Italian village in the midground, and then these figures, this sort of soldier in his beautiful uniform, and this beautiful woman here, and this figure of sort of motherhood and life-giving purpose. This is the focus. And notice how everything has this soft, ethereal quality. None of the hard edges that we're used to seeing in Florentine or Roman art. Even when we see religious scenes, as in this work by the great Venetian artist Titian, you can see in this Assumption of the Virgin, and the Assumption is a specifically Catholic belief that the Virgin did not, on her death, was taken up into heaven. And so this is what we are seeing, is this figure of the Virgin Mary, of Madonna, being taken into heaven, being lifted by cherubs, and being welcomed by the open arms of God. But look at what is emphasized here. Look at that color. Look at the beautiful layers and layers and layers of thin reds that Titian has piled on top of each other to create this sensual, rich, saturated color. You can also see that in this opening of the clouds into heavens. And then look at the way the bodies sort of overlap each other in this very sort of sensual sort of way, this kind of big mass of humanity down here at the bottom, as they are awed by the scene of the Virgin being pulled bodily into sort of the stratosphere here. This is all about beauty over everything else, guys. And sort of the kicker is this painting. This is, if you want to understand Venetian art, this is it. It's called the Venus of Urbino. It's by Titian. It's contested. What is this about? Is this a portrait of a courtesan? Is this a portrait of a man's wife? Is this Venus? It's called the Venus of Urbino, but there's nothing here that tells us we are looking at a mythological scene. It was probably given this name because it makes it a little more proper than simply saying naked lady looking at you with a sort of come hither look. That doesn't that wouldn't have flown as well in this very Catholic country. You have to kind of disguise the sensuality. You have to sort of contextualize it in a way, right? That it is acceptable. And so Greek and Roman nudes were acceptable. Greek goddesses, especially Venus, would be naked, so that's acceptable. This can't be just some naked lady. That would have been improper. This was made for a Duke of Urbino, maybe for probably for a wedding gift, but we're not exactly sure who this represents. In all honesty, it's probably just a pretty picture, like all Venetian art. But here we kind of see this Venetian sensuality overload. If we start in the back of the room, we can see these very beautiful tapestries, these tapestries coming from the Arabic world. In that window, you can see this beautiful Venetian, either sunrise or sunset. We see these large chests. This is where how Venetians in a lot of areas of Europe stored their clothes. They're not using wardrobes at this time, but these large chests. And we see a cassione, or what they're called, but you can call them chests, that's fine. And then we see this servant here. No, she's not throwing up. She is getting clothes. And then look at the clothes. Look at these silks that they're wearing. Even the servants are decked out in just the most beautiful kind of fabrics. If we look in the foreground, we can see that Titian has separated his Venus, quote-unquote Venus, from the rest of the room with these beautiful velvets. And then below her we see more silks, we see flowers, we see gold accoutrement, we see jewelry, we see this beautiful Venetian braiding and hairstyle, and then of course the woman herself on these probably silk sheets with this beautiful soft glowing in that sort of Venetian kind of yellowy orange they loved to paint their flesh tones with, looking at us in this very sensual, and no doubt about it, erotic sort of way. I mean, this is sort of the 16th century version of a centerfold, right? This is meant to be titillating. It is meant to be erotic. So, one reason why we call it Venus or why it was called Venus of Urbino is to maybe sort of play down that aspect of it just a little bit and say, no, this is a classical work of art depicting the goddess Venus, in all her glory. But really, it's meant to be viewed by primarily a male viewer as a sensual image, and sensual here definitely meaning with erotic overtones. But this is Venice. This is a Catholic culture. This is a Christian culture. So we have to temper this. And so at the base of the woman's feet, at the end of the bed, we see a little doggy. And this dog is meant to represent fidelity, the faithfulness of a wife. So, everybody, back off a little bit. This is not, this is not just some rando naked woman. This is a somebody's wife waiting for them in the bedroom, in a way, of course, that is sort of typical of a male fantasy. That's who this viewership is. This is who this painting was made primarily for. But this, to me, and to a lot of historians, this exemplifies Venetian, the idea of colorito. Not only the rich, warm colors of the Venetian life, sort of this Venetian villa, but also all the beautiful things in here. This is lifestyles of the rich and famous, right? This is MTV's Cribs. Welcome 1990s. This is MTV Cribs sort of exploding everywhere. This is the good life. That's Venetian art. It's the good life. We don't need that sort of stern morality of Florentine and Roman art. We don't need to worry. We're gonna use elements of the classical past, but we're not gonna dwell on it. We're not gonna get too intellectual here. Let's look at some pretty stuff. Let's look at some beautiful homes and some beautiful stuff in those homes and some beautiful people and call it a day. Venetian art. Yeah. We're going to skip that last image, and we're going to move to a period called Mannerism. Mannerism is what follows the High Renaissance. It's basically the mid to late 16th century, and this is where things start to get weird. Something that is mannered is stylized. It is not natural. If I spoke in a mannered way, it would be like this, for instance. I'd put on sort of a fake accent. Mannered is very purposeful. And this takes the sort of Renaissance, a high Renaissance idea of I'm an artist and I get to do whatever the hell I want because this painting, this canvas, this sculpture is my world. It is my creation and I'm the artist and I rule over this little world of the painting, or I rule over this little world of the sculpture. That gets taken to this sort of extreme degree where realism and naturalism are completely thrown out of the window. So we just don't have some sort of like hazy Leonardo sfumato. We just don't have some really chiseled, muscular Michelangelo type figures. What we have here are figures that are physically impossible. This is Parmigianino's Madonna of the Long Neck, as you can see why. Look at this figure of the Madonna. Her body is completely distorted. We not only have this long neck, but these elongated, impossibly long fingers, this extremely long torso, and these exaggerated legs. It almost looks like her thighs are longer than her shins. And then we have this figure over here with this extremely long leg. These are all like supermodels. Then over here we have this stretched out Christ child, once again, with an emphasis on this elongated forms. These are not naturalistic figures by any means. Also, gone is any sort of rational, symmetrical composition. Instead, we have these kinds of S forms. We kind of have these S forms everywhere. It's called the figura serpentinata, a serpentine figure. These snake-like sorts of undulating forms dominate everything. Mannerism is about the artist's vision above everything else. Here's an odd painting. This was either painted for one of the Medici or a guy named Francesco Salviati. It is, ultimately that doesn't matter. What matters here is whatever is going on in this painting. This is one of those paintings that historians have been trying to figure out the exact meaning for years. And ultimately we don't know. We see in the center Venus with golden apples. This is from Greek mythology. This is from an event called the Judgment of Paris. And then we see Cupid next to his mom. So let's stop there. So we see Venus, and we see that the figura serpentinata. We see the serpentine figure, the spelling again, and with her, but it's not as dramatic as we saw in the Madonna of the Long Neck. But we see it in Cupid, and his body isn't in this impossible position. The human body just doesn't move that way. There's definitely a disconnect between his head, neck, and shoulders going on behind Venus's arm. And then we see this weird interplay between the mother and son. We see this almost sensual sort of kiss. And then in the background we see what may be an allegory of time. Over here we see what could be oblivion. This woman here might represent jealousy. There's all of these figures that have been interpreted different ways, and are interacting in a way that might be allegorical. It might add up to some sort of meaning, but what ultimately that meaning is, we're not exactly sure, because there no longer is any sort of strong moral message or allegory here. The Mannerist period is not only sort of extreme in the way the artist painted and these twisted, turning, elongated, impossible figures, but it's also sort of extreme in the way it tells stories. And oftentimes, portraying a clear message is not what's important. What's important is sort of showing off the artist's talents and their abilities and their sort of desire to push the envelope and to push things further than they really ever have gone before, and to put their vision, even if that vision might be muddled or weird or obscure, over on everybody else. And let's see. Let's take a look at Veronese. This is a very odd painting. It's called Christ in the House of Levi. It is from the refectory of Santi Giovanni Paolo. It's in Venice, and it is an odd image. It was originally painted to be a Last Supper, but it came under the eye of the Catholic Church. And at the time, the Catholic Church had something called the Inquisition. The Inquisition was designed to sort of track down heretics and to put them on trial, to inquire about their activities, and then ultimately to judge them and in very many cases punish them. This was a period of extreme violence in Italian history and within the history of the Catholic Church. A lot of people were executed in very horrible ways during the Inquisition. And what Veronese was very much under the suspicion because of this painting, because it portrayed this Last Supper filled with all of these weird figures. You have dwarves, and you have these comically drunk sort of figures. You have things that have nothing to do with the Last Supper. You have people gambling, you have people drinking, and it was considered to be heretical. It was considered to be immoral. He was put on trial, and basically he explained it away as, look, I had these empty areas, and I just wanted to kind of fill them with various things, and I thought as an artist, I'd have a little bit of freedom to kind of put whatever I want wherever I want, and I'm no harm, no foul. The Catholic Church said, you have 3 months to correct this, and if you don't, bad things will definitely happen to you. And so instead of correcting the painting, he changed the name. And so he changes it to a sort of minor incident in the New Testament, where Christ goes among a bunch of drunkards in the house of Levi and ministers to them. And basically the idea is, these are the people who need my help the most. These sinners, these drunkards, these are the ones I need to take care of. And then the Catholic Church basically went, okay, that's fine. But this was originally meant to be a Last Supper. And if you can compare this to sort of the reverence of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, you have this big, rambling, shambling feast with all of these crazy characters and drunkenness and debauchery kind of happening around this central figure of Christ. It's like no Last Supper that had ever been seen before. And really, it's Veronese just kind of having fun, just sort of putting in all these kind of comical, weird sort of scenarios and situations, because he wanted to, because it was his sort of artistic right to. But this is where Mannerism butts up against the beliefs of Catholic doctrine. And once there was only, that line could only be crossed so far before the church kind of, you experience backlash from the church. And that is exactly what happened here to Veronese. this is a interior courtyard of the Palazzo del Te. This is in Mantua. The important thing about this is the experimentalism that Romano, the architect, is having here. You'll notice that there are, in this courtyard, we have these typical Greek triangular pediments alternating with these Roman-style arches. But there's a lot of fun that he's having here, playing with deep shadow and more shallow depth. But the weirdness really comes in these, what's called a triglyph, Triglyph. These little three marks, that's why they're called triglyphs, decorations date back to ancient Greece. But he's done something weird with them. It's almost like they're falling out of place. He's kind of experimenting and having a little fun here. This is the nature. This is Mannerism to a T. The artist kind of pushing the envelope for its own sake. Let's have a little fun here. Let's see what we can get away with. Let's try out some new ideas. And whether it sort of fits into tradition or fits into what's proper or what's moral or what's this or that or the other, we don't really care. Let's have some fun. And that's kind of what Mannerism is about. It's the artist now completely unbound. There are no rules. Well, until the Catholic Church says you've crossed the line, and then there are definitely rules.